Welcome, and you'll be able to view a recording of the session from today online as well. So my name's the Reverend Randall. I've been here since the end of, or the middle of December 2020, and so it's my privilege to lead this church where it is today. I'm one of many leaders that have been through the church. I'm one of many people that has been at St Barnabas across the years. Who here has had a family connection? Put up your hand if you've had a family connection with St Barnabas members. Wow, there's lots of hands going up. I would love to hear your stories about St Barnabas. St Barnabas is a church that has impacted many families, seen many families come through, continues to see many families come through its doors. It's been described as a small, pretty church. The chapel on the hill I saw on some of the estate auctions as the land around us has been auctioned off. It's a church that has been deeply, over its 150 years, connected to the community around it. This afternoon, I'm not going to do much talking. I helped work on our history with Matthew and Sally and others who've contributed to the most recent update. The recent update of our history is very much a work in progress. I think when history was first written about churches like us, it told the stories of the ministers and the people in it, but the church is the people of God, and it's the stories about the people. And so we're looking to fill our history with more stories about people. And so if you have stories as you read through our history that you would like to contribute to it, I would love to hear them. And so you're able to, there's a little note in the front of our history where you can send those history stories to. We are also looking for photos. We've got the Rogues Gallery of previous ministers currently sits in my office. You can look through it after, when you're having a cup of tea, after our time of sharing now. But I would love to see pictures with the people of God at St Barnabas, as well as the minister. But in the end, we're just the hired guns that blow through the doors. It's the families that have been part of St Barnabas that really make the church what it is. And so it's my privilege to offer you the opportunity to pick up a copy of our 150th history. We're charging $10 for it. It's something that will go towards us continuing to build this as a work. And so across this next year, we're trying to bring it to a place where we're really happy with it. So as you pick it up today, we're really wanting you to pick it up and go, this is a work in progress that I could contribute something to. And so we would love to hear those stories you have to offer. I'll let the history speak for itself. We celebrate our 150th service on the 22nd of December 2022. That's really close to Christmas. And so we're going to have a service on that day at 10:30 a.m. that you'll be welcome to come along to. We also will be having on our 150th St Barnabas Day another service where we celebrate our 150th St Barnabas Day together. So we're using the whole year to celebrate a little bit of what we're doing as a church. Two things I would love, if you're interested in coming, these are things that we're doing to just bless the community. We have a regular coffee outing. You can come along to this at Olive Lane on the 18th of October at 2 p.m. You don't need to RSVP. Look for the crowd of people that are enjoying coffee and food together. There's flyers for both these things. And the other is a trivia night where we're raising money to relieve poverty in Sri Lanka. And so if you are pretty good at trivia, and I think I'm speaking to the right group of people, or maybe the wrong if my team wants to win, come along to our trivia night on the 22nd of October. And so there's a flyer where the history books are as well that we'd love to invite you along to. I'm going to invite the next person to come and speak is Matthew Etty-Leal, and he's a valued member of our church, and he is going to be talking about the building.
Yep.
So over to you, Matthew.
It's just
So these are your slides. So it's on your first slide.
Okay, following on from Randall, this is a very diverse congregation, if I could put it that way. We have 3 history societies, local ones, Surrey Hills, Canterbury and Box Hill, and hopefully we'll also have Camberwell. And some of the people here are also members of that historical society. I'm welcoming you with 2 roles, one with the church and one as the president of the Balwyn Historical Society. We have past ministers here, and I welcome Ernest Yorth, Alex Kornacheski, and Brian Westerway, and Judy and Joan with them. And now, right up the back, we have the St Barnabas Cricket Club former members, and one of our former curates, Tim Thorne, might have come today, but he also wrote part of the history, and he played cricket for St Barnabas. St Barnabas had 4 daughter churches, and we have representatives from Holy Trinity, Surrey Hills, maybe St Paul's Canterbury, but the St Paul's Canterbury is where I better think about this, the Canterbury History Society meets. Yep, welcome Neil. And and a number of past parishioners. So it's lovely to see people who have been an important part of the church also here. But what am I going to talk about? Gin boxes and faith. Now that was the title which Hilary Blakeman, who worshipped here, came up with, and I will get to the point which mentions gin boxes. So, often I sort of think, is there something wrong with my fingers? But no, the first one is the Reverend Taylor, please, Randall. Now, so look at him. European settlers wanted a local school and church in Balwyn. In May 1868, the vicar of Holy Trinity Church, Kew, Reverend Ronald Haywood, rode his horse on Sunday afternoons to the Athenaeum Hall, just down, and sorry, we will go to that one. Athenaeum Hall in Balwyn Road to conduct services. He did this for 2 years, accompanied by a young woman who played the harmonium. A change in parish for Reverend Haywood meant that St John's Camberwell began supporting the church, which became known as St Barnabas. And now we'll go on to Reverend Taylor. Now, the window, one of the windows is here, but afterwards we've got a number of copies of stained glass window booklets. So if anyone would like a copy of the booklet, please feel free to take it when we go to afternoon tea. So he took over the services. The early parishioners and board of governors of St Barnabas included men from a wide range of employment and means. The obvious first one is John, next one, thanks, John Butler Mailing. And so he was as a carpenter, and we'll go on to his tools. So here's the tools that he worked with at the time. And then we go on to a slide, but you can see it here. So Randall dropped down earlier today and picked it up from Philip's house. And so he would walk around, and I won't spoil Philip's thunder, with his tool chest and tools. Who else was there? Edward Green Snowden. Thanks, Randall. And here he is, a founder of the church, honorary lay reader for 36 34 years. And there was an important point about him that I'm pretty sure he owned Monmouth. So and Monmouth was one of 15 acres on Monmouth Avenue, just off Canterbury Road. And he was a solicitor and the chief examiner of titles for the state of Victoria. Maybe we should ask Philip what on earth that means later, but no worries. Harry M. Perry, William Sewell, who was a civil servant, V. Cofford, who was a Danish settler. Now, John Day Hotel, thanks, Randall. So there was a wonderful time when in Boroondara we actually had hotels. But then we had a vote in 1920. And so the Survey Hotel, as you can see, was near the corner of Whitehorse and Burke Roads, Whitehorse between Walsh Street and Barnsbury Road. And obviously it stopped being licensed after the opinion poll in 1920. The community was very much a Presbyterian community, if you want an explanation for that. And moving on, we have H.W.C. Smith, who was the first Balwyn blacksmith. I couldn't find him with a surname like Smith. It would have been a struggle. So here's what a blacksmith shop looked like in the 19th century. And that was only a few metres from here. Right, where, what, the original post office or? The new post office, thank you. Yep, so not far away. Now, the next one, Frederick Funkhauser. As people in the Balwyn Historical Society will know, one of our members, Marilyn, who's luckily in England at the moment, has done a number of talks on the Funkhauser family. And so here's George and Martha in 1886. He was a local nurseryman. Frank Rennick was classed as a gentleman, a civil engineer, and a chief engineer of Victorian Railways. And there's a window for him too, I think. But anyway, we can check that later. And a person called D. Smith, who was an early treasurer. In 1922, Mr. William Mayling spoke to school children about early settlement. And I'll let Philip explain who William Mayling was. The early settlers were poor and worked hard, initially in tents or bark huts served as homes. Cutting and carding wood was essential for domestic and building use. The home had little furniture. Seats were a luxury, with most people sitting on gin boxes. It is not recorded whether these boxes were full or empty. Now, another one, next one, thanks, Randall. Here he is as the first mayor of Camberwell in his mayoral robes. John and the other initial founders of the church often discussed building a church sitting on their gin boxes. So there is logic in having Hilary call this particular part of the history gin boxes and faith. It cost £350 to build the church. The Ray family sold some land for the building and area. Our first minister, George Herbert Taylor, raised £200 and other locals raised the remaining £150. An article in the Church of England Messenger of January the 2nd, 1873 reads, "A new church dedicated to God in the name of St Barnabas has been opened in the district of Camberwell. The building is on a very good site, built on high ground, about 6 miles from Melbourne on the Liddell Road." The next one, thanks. Now, another person, as Robin and a number of us in the Balwyn Historical Society know, and the importance of Andrew Murray. Balwyn had lots of vineyards, and so it means in Gaelic the home of the vine. And so there was literally a vineyard across the road. And initially the house was called Balwyn House, and then later Tourmont was built on the site. And we've heard Anne Hawker, the archivist of Fintona, talk about the history of Fintona. And the interesting thing about that was that any old Fintona girls here? And Janet, and Margaret Cunningham was an amazing woman, and the school used to be where the Congregationals had their place in Burke Road, and they were thinking, we must move, it's not big enough. And she decided that she would solve the problem as a teacher, so she bought the site. And it had a covenant by Andrew Murray saying that it couldn't be a school. That wasn't going to stop her. And so it became a school. And there we are. So John Butler Mailing was responsible for actual erection of the church. It is thought that our church has the name St Barnabas due to the familiarity with St Barnabas selling his land to give to the church, and the Ray family providing their land for the church. On the Sunday, the 22nd of December, which Randall's mentioned, was the first public worship service. Next one, thanks, Randall. Here is the Bishop, Dr. James Morehouse. He worked at the Melbourne Diocese, and he constituted the parish of Balwyn. St Barnabas reopened temporarily for worship soon afterwards. Memorial stone was laid by Edward Snowden's wife. Please, Randall. Maria Victoria Snowden. And to commemorate the reopening of the church on May the 15th, 1883. The church was still too small and closed until 1984 to increase the size of the nave, which allowed 140 seats plus a wooden chancel. The early vicarage was Taylor House, named after the first minister, and that was his private residence. After he left for another parish in 1888, the church bought the residence for future vicars and families to live in. Mailing Hall, formerly the Sunday School Hall, was designed by John's son, and there's a photograph of him here, but here he is, in 1896, and built by available parishioners and friends. In the early 20th century, a pulpit was built and carved by William Mailing, who was then the church secretary. A separate kindergarten was erected in 1912. The church was completed in 1930 in the initial building. Over half the money for the extensions came from anonymous gift on the strict condition that the work be carried out by the Mailing family. And here's Charles Mailing's family, and I'll let you read the comments there. So we've got Charles and his wife at the top in the middle, and then daughters with children. In March 1930, the anonymous offer was made by Charles and to build a chancel and 2 vestries for £1,250. So not an awful lot of money, you would think. It was completed by Charles, his sons and co-workers in December 1930. Now, we're not sure who the sons were, so that's again something which any information would be greatly appreciated. In talking to Philip, who will speak shortly, he gave me a fair bit of stuff yesterday, and I enjoyed the headline of this article, When St Barnabas Was Just a Little Country Church, and so 150 years ago. So that gives me the lead in to welcome Philip. Now, Philip is a member of the Canterbury History Society, and I heard all about his mum a while ago at one of your meetings. He's a barrister, and he could have walked here, did he? Or he did walk, yes. He lives just the other side of Mont Albert Road, and he originally lived in another house, but I'll let Philip tell you about that. Thank you.
There's a computer here or a laptop. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going to speak for 40 to 45 minutes. Matthew has asked me to keep it to that. So I'm going to talk about John Butler Mailing and his family. As I said to Matthew, some of the family members I know about and others I don't, I'm afraid, but I'll do the best I can. As regards where this is all based on, in the 1980s, my late mother, who was John's granddaughter, and she was at that point a retired scientist, she decided to write a history of John Butler Mailing, and it was about 30 pages, but she researched it carefully. So she got hold of documents. She also rounded up her cousins, and she got their recollections. She also relied on what her mother had told her, and she also discovered other documents. She also told me some things, and after she died, my stepfather told me things also. So this is where this stuff comes from. My mother was used to writing for publication in scientific journals, so she footnoted everything, and that's good. Some of the statements I'm going to make, you can see what their origin was by going to the footnote. John Butler Mailing was born in 1840 at Shepworth in Cambridgeshire. He was born out of wedlock. He knew who his mother was, obviously. I'm not quite sure that he knew who his father was, and this was ultimately, such was, you'll appreciate in 19th century England, being born or not being born in wedlock was an important thing, and I think this led him to migrate. An interesting sequel to all this is that in 1897 it was proposed he become a Justice of the Peace, and so he went to Sir whatever Snowden it was, whose photo you saw earlier today, who he knew, and he said to Snowden, I was born out of wedlock. Does this stigma mean I should not become a Justice of the Peace? And Snowden said, become a Justice of the Peace. So the interesting sequel to that is that my best man at my wedding was Snowden's great-great-grandson, and I'm having dinner with him this evening. Mailing's mother did subsequently married and stayed in England to the end of her life, and wanted to come to Australia, but apparently he wouldn't sponsor her. So he didn't regard himself as having much gratitude to her. He grew up in his grandparents' house in Shepworth in Cambridgeshire. In that house was an uncle also called John Butler Mailing, 11 years older, and there was also an aunt called Charlotte, 9 years older. Both of them came to Melbourne. late in life, John Butler Mailing remembered that as a child it was his job to sweep snow off the thatched roof outside the window of the attic in which he slept. His grandfather was an agricultural labourer. His grandmother was the church caretaker and a cleaner and acted as a guide to visitors. On one occasion, he took over that job from her as a teenager, I would assume, and on one occasion he showed a lady and gentleman through the church and he impressed them, and they asked for permission to nominate him for an endowed place at their disposal in the Colbatch Charity School in Orwell. So there he learnt the 3 R's, and that stood him in good stead. He learnt the trade of a carpenter and joiner, and then after working as 6 months in England, at the age of 17, he migrated to Australia to join his uncle of the same name, who had arrived in 1854, was married and also a carpenter. That's Uncle Mailing. John Butler apparently put his age up to 18. In 1857, Uncle Mailing purchased 13 acres on the south side of Whitehorse Road, west of Union Road. At that time, there were possibly 3 small houses on Whitehorse Road between this land and the western boundary of Camberwell. He established a house and market garden. The house, or part of it, is still there. It's 25 Weybridge Street on the corner of James Street. I think it's been added to, but I understand the basic house is there. John Butler, my ancestor, left England in 1857, aged 17, as an assistant immigrant on the ship Joshua, which was sailing to Sydney. Now, interestingly, in the 1980s, my mother, based on a conversation with her cousin, Reverend Charlie Mailing, who I think is the son of the person after whom that window is named and who I think might have been in a photo earlier. My mother wrote this in the 1980s. He bought his tools of trade in a wooden carpenter's chest made by himself. His saw was fixed under the lid. His wooden planes were on the bottom. There were lift-out trays for small tools and oddments. The chest was labelled in paint with his name and the good ship Joshua, 1857. 70 years later, this chest was still in his workshop. So this is interesting. This is the Reverend Charlie Mailing, talking to my mother in the 1980s about his recollections back from, I would say, the 1920s. But the intriguing thing is I made this statement at a meeting of the Canterbury History Society where I gave this talk some years ago, and a wonderful thing happened at the end of that meeting. It's normal to thank a speaker and possibly give them a little something, but in any event, a lady, Robin Adams, part of that society, gave me this. And the amazing story, I'm not sure who had it before Robin, but someone had given this to Robin on condition it not be sold, and she now gave it to me. And so the interesting thing is that Charlie Mailing remembered the good ship Joshua, 1857. That was his recollection going back 60 or 70 years. The interesting thing is it's, in fact, John Butler Mailing, immigrant to Sydney, ship Joshua. So that is it. Okay, on the trip, Joshua, he took £5, and the journey took 3 months to Sydney. He lost almost all of the £5 gambling on cards and never again gambled on cards, and I assume, being a good Anglican, didn't gamble on anything else either. On his first night in Australia, he slept on the post office steps in Sydney. He stayed in Sydney some months. For a few weeks he worked as a sawmill at Glebe. He also had a job sorting sheep's heads and was enabled to take home as many as he liked, a privilege which he valued because the brains, tongue and meat on the head made a good meal with soup from the bones. He then walked to Melbourne along Sydney Road, calling at farms all along the way, offering to work in return for food and shelter. And so he was valued. He was over 6 foot in height and probably a good worker. And he had letters of introduction from farmers that he would give down the road. And he carried with him, or he got with him to Melbourne, the chest and a heavy overcoat given to him by his Aunt Charlotte when he left England, and she thought probably totally unsuited for the Australian climate. But he had to get both of them to Melbourne by foot, and you tell me how he did it. There's no account. I would have thought wheels were involved. You would have thought so, wouldn't you? Okay. On arrival in Melbourne, he lived with his uncle. He worked for him briefly trenching and also doing quarrying, labouring and farm work. Because he had the 3 R's, he could make a bit of extra money, and he was literate. And on one occasion, he successfully conducted a romance. A man wanted to write to a woman who he liked, and John Butler Mailing wrote the letter on his behalf and went to the lady. She also was illiterate, and she asked him, not knowing he'd written the other letter, if she could write her letter. And so one way or another, with him writing the letters on both sides, he brought the thing to a successful conclusion, and apparently neither party knew that he had written the other man's letters, the party's letters. In 1861, he leased and subsequently bought 13 acres of bushland on the south side of Whitehorse Road, immediately west of his uncle's property. This land runs from Whitehorse Road south to Weybridge Street. It's now Shepworth, Meldreth Street and the Chatham Primary School, Banall Road. It's in that area. He stayed there all his life. He built a 2-roomed cottage of mud brick. Between the house and the road was West Creek, running east to west. The creek was still there at the time of the First World War. It was a depression starting near Union Road and deepening as it flowed west to near Northcote Avenue. Now, in 1922, it was the 50th anniversary of some form of education in Victoria. I think it's compulsory education up to a certain age. And so what the Canterbury State School got the idea that they would send a couple of pupils to interview elderly people who had memories, and John Butler Mailing was interviewed, and this is in the State Library. This is a facsimile my mother got, and so these 2 boys interviewed him. At that point, he was the oldest pioneer in the district. And this is his recollection in 1922. I came here in 1859, 63 years ago, about the same time as Mr. Murray, Mr. Brown, Mr. Hawford, Mr. Hoford, a Dane, Mr. Sell, Mr. Ainger, and my uncle. Our houses were of very primitive nature, for they were only common bark huts or tents, there being no real houses until I built my weatherboard house, the one in which I now live. The locality was covered with bush so dense that one could not see the road, which is now quite easily seen and which a tram now runs along. So that's Whitehorse Road. In those days, the road was nothing but a deep morass, and when the bullock drays carting wood went along the road, they were drawn under by the suction of oozing mud. The bullocks got their heads into it and they were suffocated. The wattles grew so closely together that it was difficult to get through them to the road. There was also some large timber, the largest I've ever seen. I knew of a great red gum tree that stood in the middle of the road, so that's in the middle of Whitehorse Road, up near Union Road, and that a man named Collie was granted permission to cut it down to clear the roadways. He was carting tons of wood for all the winter. I've not bought a stick of firewood for 63 years, for I had my own trees on my own estate. At the time when I came, the immigration system was in full swing and all kinds of settlers, mostly English, Irish and Swedes, settled here. A little later, the Shire of Nuttawading was named the land of the wild woodcarters because they were always carting wood on account of the absence of coal. No coach was able to pass along as yet, but later on the coach ran as far as Lilydale. My word, you lads cannot think of what we had to do in the old coaching days now that you ride in trams and trains. When we came, we were all poor. When I speak of we, I mean the men who were also here, 8 in all. So poor we could not raise a £10 note between us. When the thought of building a school simmered through a few of us, we was faced by a stiff problem of how to pay for its erection. However, we eventually got it built, but it cost £10, a big sum in those days. It was the first school and the first church, and the school still stands in Balwyn Road, Canterbury. Later, a hotel was built. It was called the Survey, and it still stands a mile down from my place, so I think we had a photo of that. Balwyn at that time was called Burundara, a native word meaning a place of shade. Every day, new chums from England came wearing the old English dress, the gaiters, breeches and shoes with silver buckles. The tradesman problem was a great one. There were no tradesmen nearer than where Kew now stands. They could not come even if they wanted to, for they were afraid of the morasses. But in summertime, it was just the opposite. There was 2 feet of red dust, which if I had cleared the wattles from the front of my house would have blown in our rooms and made everything filthy. Our only sport was cutting and carting wood all day, but at night we had better times. We used to go to each other's houses and have a bit of good old fun. There were easy chairs for the host and hostess, and others sat mostly on gin boxes. The only accommodation we had. We could not therefore entertain the governor's ladies, because they would have had to sit on the boxes. We were fortunate though, because the majority of the sparse population understood music and there were violinists and songsters. Shortly everyone understood music. The only thing I cannot remember was when the first train came. I remember the train well enough. It consisted of a puffing billy for an engine and a small carriage with first and second compartments. There was no station, but when the people wanted to get out, they informed the driver. The nearest stopping place was Camberwell, and the nearest way to get to it was across the paddocks. We cultivated the land for fruit trees, and to keep the ground in order, we grew copse. My paddocks are all split up now into smaller ones. Okay, so that's what he said to those boys in 1922. He also had a job for 5 years as a clerk to a Mr. Bellett. So you remember Bellett Street runs off Burwood Road, who had a hay and corn shore on the south side of Burwood Road, Hawthorn, almost opposite Golding Street. So that's where Bunnings is. The store was managed by a Mr. and Mrs. William Saunders, who had come to Melbourne in 1853. They had owned the coaching house at Chesham in Buckinghamshire. They'd been ruined by the coming of the railways. They migrated with their children, in particular a daughter, Jane. They lived close to where the Hawthorn railway station now is. They lived in tents, awaiting a supply of building materials by a later ship, walking to and from Port Melbourne. But by the time the materials arrived, they were so hard up they had to sell the materials. John Mailing took over the bookkeeping from Mrs. Saunders, and he proposed marriage to their daughter Jane. Jane had been born in 1845, and she'd been recommended by the Hawthorne State School as a needlework assistant, and she was a milliner. Her mother insisted that Jane give up work for a year to learn how to manage a home. They were married in 1864 at Christ Church, Hawthorne. They had 12 children, 9 of whom survived infancy. We saw a picture earlier of Charles, and I was very interested to see that because my grandmother is in that picture. I'd never seen that. I'm not quite clear that the family members, as stated in that, are quite correct. But anyway, in any event, these are his children. William, born in 1865. Okay, so that's William, a lifelong member of this church. Fred, born in 1867. Emily, who was known as Sis, who married John Funkhauser. So I think Funkhauser is one of your founders also. I'm not sure if it's him. John, Jane, Polly, Mary Ann, who married Frederick White, Charles Henry, after whom the window is named, 1875, Alice, who married Henry Tobias, George in 1880, and finally Ellen Grace Nellie, my grandmother, in 1882, who married William Isaac Hayward. I will talk, because I'm asked to speak about the family, I will talk to some extent about them later, or some of them anyway. After marriage, I suppose I'll talk about the ones who had descendants, but there's actually this picture, they're there. There's some insets there also. This was after Jane had died, and there's some insets. Interestingly, one of the insets is Fred, who was deceased at that point. Fred had in fact died at Bulawayo in Africa. My mother used to tell me that she was told growing up he'd been eaten by a tiger in Africa. There, of course, are no tigers in Africa. After marriage, John Butler Mailing walked back and forth to various parts of Melbourne to work for 9 to 10 hours a day, 6 days a week as a carpenter. So he only came home on Sundays. One job he had was at Pentridge Jail. And to get to Pentridge Jail, he walked with a man called Ainger, who was a stonemason. You could understand they might have needed a bit of stone out at Pentridge Jail, but I suppose they needed a bit of carpentry also. I actually know John Ainger. There's Aingers in Richmond, and I conjecture that was his ancestor. In any event, to get from here, just up the road to Pentridge, they walked. So they must have walked late on a Sunday afternoon, or no, it would have been early on a Monday morning, I suspect. They went across paddocks, across post and rail fences. They crossed the Yarra on fallen logs over the Chandler Highway, where the Chandler Highway Bridge now is, or if the river was swollen, over the Johnson Street Bridge. And so they got to Pentridge. And so, as I said, he was working away from home. When they had saved enough, he wanted to buy a couch to rest in comfort on Sundays. But Jane persuaded him instead to buy a cow, tempting him with promises of butter and cream. but he didn't get any of it because she sold it and eggs, sometimes walking to the nearest shops, and the nearest shops were where the Hawthorn Town Hall now is. But she made sufficient money to be able to purchase a couch, so he did get his couch, but not the produce of the cow. Jane had a sunny nature. She sang as she worked, as did he. They had a piano and organ in the sitting room. She made him a favourite dish, which was bread and warm milk sprinkled with sugar. He was a good singer. Jane died, my great-grandmother, died in 1884, aged 39, of puerperal fever for 13 days. And so this is a reminder about the value of obstetrics, isn't it? I'm informed that she was pregnant and the baby was impacted. The baby couldn't be got out, and so the cure was there was no cure. You gave the mother laudanum to ease her end. So the baby died, became septic, and the mother went afterwards, hopefully with her pains abated somewhat by the laudanum. When he visited Nellie, my grandmother, who had puerperal fever in 1920, he said, just like Jane, and he could not stay. He married later twice, but she was his dearest wife. After his death, after Jane's death in 1884, Sis, who was later Funkhauser, took over the housekeeping. 2 years after Jane died, he married Anne Bailey, and later she was helped by Alice Tobias, who later became Tobias, and then my granny was taken out of school aged 12 to help. Anne, their stepmother, taught them housekeeping. She taught them that when washing, the importance of the rinse, and when cleaning, to take care of the sides and middle. If you take care of the sides, the middle will take care of itself. This is my mother writing it down, but she'd obviously been told by her mother. She said, in hot weather, to throw away doubtful food. An empty house is better than a bad tenant, namely the house being your stomach. His second wife died in 1908, and his third wife outlived him by a year. He was he became a prosperous builder, and he trained his sons in this. I think estate agents have discovered the mailing name. One house I'm aware of he built that's still there is 13 Balwyn Road, which is just down here, and it's a very nice Victorian house, and here it is advertised for sale some years ago called Mailing Memories. And the journalist who wrote this got hold of my mother's document, and so a lot of it's quoted in there. The giveaway that it was done by the mailings is that the house is named Shepreth, and it still has that name. So Shepreth was where he was born. He was a man of his time, so I say that to you as an introduction to what I'm now about to read. He was a man of his time, okay, so we can't judge him by modern standards. All his children held him in high regard. I'm reading from my mother's document. His older children did not remember him as being severe, but the younger ones recalled punishments that were as hard as was the practice of the time. They probably suffered from the lack of a mother to supervise them, and intercede for them with their father. That's my mother writing. One can agree that they sometimes richly deserve punishment, as when the boys got drunk on the store of homemade wine, forbidden to them, and he nearly killed Charlie by hanging him from the rafter. Now, he got that story, my mother got that from her mother. So the interesting, conversation with Una Davidson, who was my mother's cousin. Now, the interesting thing is the window to Charlie is just up there. So Charlie later became a pillar of this church, and so possibly the near hanging by his father for drinking homemade wine possibly led to habits of abstemiousness, but perhaps laid the moral foundation to enable him to become a pillar of this church. Grandfather, I continue to read, grandfather used a horsewhip for the boys. He used a horsewhip for the boys, but never lifted a hand to the girls. For them, he had another way. When mother, that's my grandmother, was dusting his desk, she saw Darwin's Origin of Species, opened at a page where the bones of paws, hooves, wings and claws were compared with those of hands and feet. She was enthralled and did not hear her father coming. He believed that women were ruined by education and was enraged, locking mother in her room for 3 days with only bread and water, though her brothers smuggled other food to her through the window. So he was happy for women to be trained in domestic skills. But the interesting thing is my granny decided to train as a nurse, and she trained at the Alfred Hospital against his wishes. My mother just says just with his opposition, but my mother told me that he threatened to cut her off without sixpence if she did it. But she did it, and she became a qualified nurse. When she was at home, aged 12, she would cook for her brothers. They would have steak, but often they were so rushed they would just take it out in their hands. My mother told me that they were a bit of practical jokers. I'm going to guess that my granny was married here, and they were practical jokers, and they put back the clocks in the house. They put them back by half an hour or an hour on her wedding day. So, okay, with the consequence, she was late for her wedding. I suppose brides are normally late, but she was possibly later than many. Okay, now there was the original mud brick cottage was enlarged in weatherboard with many rooms. It was the first weatherboard house east of Balwyn Road. It was called the Willows. Now, I also read something from this document. It is quite intriguing, but it reads as follows. There was a well-scrubbed table and benches under the back veranda of the Willows, and there people, often Aborigines who asked for help, were given as much food and tea as they could eat and drink, even some to take away, but grandfather would never allow them to be given money. And so you go to the footnote, and that's based on my granny's recollection. She'd obviously told that to my mother. As I read that, I'm intrigued by the reference to Aborigines. One would, of course, like to know the date, because he lived at the Willows from the 1860s through to his death. So you would like to know whether Aborigines were still asking for help at a particular date, but we don't know because it's not stated. They were regular worshippers at this church. So I'm now going to read what my mother put down, and it may have overlapped a little bit with what you've been told, but there's some additional stuff also. The family were regular worshippers at St Barnabas, where the youngest son, George, rang the bell. So maybe that was the bell we saw earlier today, I don't know. and pumped the organ bellows. His siblings wrote BR and OB, so BR bell ringer, and OB organ bellows after his name in his school books to tease him. Sometimes he slipped out to play during the sermon, causing a long silence after the concluding hymn was announced while he was recalled to his organ blowing. So that's about this church. In his, my mother also wrote this. They built St Barnabas Church. Grandfather constructed the original shingled church, opened in 1872, added a porch and belfry soon after, and extended the nave and added the transepts in the 1880s with the help of his sons. 1907, his eldest son William carved the present pulpit. The church was completed by the Mailing family in 1930. He also built the original Balwyn State School, mostly from home-burnt bricks. He was a dignified gentleman. Nellie, my grandmother, remembers cleaning her father's shoes. He would put a penny in the toe, saying when she offered it back that someone who was so careless deserved to lose it. On turning 50 in 1890, he retired as a builder but became a buyer and seller of land. Between 1862 and 1912, he purchased 17 properties. He also owned property at Mount Macedon. He was not a believer in banks, and so he was not affected by the 1890s depression. He had money to lend. He taught his children to be careful with money. He was a councillor of the Boroondara Shire, then City of Camberwell, from 1886 to 1916. He was the first mayor of Camberwell in 1905. And so there is Mailing Road. As I said, he became a JP in 1897. He often sat on the bench at, it would have been the Camberwell Court of Petty Sessions. On one occasion, an unlicensed grocer in Prospect Hill Road was before him. This man was on Prospect Hill Road on the hill west of Riversdale Station. So, yeah, well, that's, of course, yes, up the hill. And he kept some liquor for regular customers, but he was unlicensed. One hot afternoon, two men who said they'd been working on the Outer Circle Railway asked his son, who was minding the shop, for a drink, asking the shopkeeper's song. They were licensing inspectors, but they took advantage of the boy. They didn't tell him that. And the boy apparently asked where they'd been working, and they said they'd been working on the railways, but in fact they were licensing inspected. And so they were charged and came before him, but he dismissed the case because he said he could not accept the evidence of self-confessed liars. His home, the Willows, was named that for trees that lined the creek. He developed the land as a farm, modelling it and its buildings and brick courtyard on the farms of Cambridgeshire. He'd known as a boy. He made hay for the last time in 1980, when he was aged 80. So that's in about 1921. I have a photo. Not quite sure of the provenance of this photo, but that is him on his land cutting hay. So that's up where Chatham Primary School is, Shepworth Meldreth Street. At age 82, he cut down a huge old red gum tree, and and cut it into 2-foot lengths for firewood using his old axe, wedge and hammers. He wheeled it down the paddock in his timber barrow and stacked it in huge stacks at the bottom of his garden near the cow gate. Said, "That will do me till I die," and it did. He had 2 cows, then 1, and he milked them. He wore an old blue knitted wooling cap. A grandson, that would be Charlie Mailing, the son of the man who got drunk with his brothers. Grandson remembered crossing a stile regularly to get a large treacle tin of skimmed milk. So in the 1920s, some land on the south boundary was sold to Chatham Primary, and then there was more land sold for tax reasons and building blocks, and so we have Shepworth and Meldreth Street. He lived in the Willows all his life. When he died, the house was demolished and the land was sold. In the 1980s, Charlie Mailing said to my mother that the southern end of the property was never fully cleared. It was left with a large number of yellow box trees, some of which still remained in the grounds of Chatham Primary. And I understand the conversation in the last several years, there is a huge tree in the grounds of Chatham Primary, and that is the one of those original trees that he did not cut down. By the 1922, he was the oldest pioneer in the district. My mother, it's not a good move to drop your notes, even if you want to speak from another document. My mother wrote this from her own recollection. In his declining years, grandfather became forgetful and disoriented. He was persuaded to sell land for a song. When out walking, he would lose his way, but everyone knew him as father, and he was always guided home. My own memories of him date from this time because he was 76 when I was born. My sister, that's Auntie Peggy, was born when he was 80, was his youngest grandchild. I doubt that he ever really understood who we were when we visited him. I well remember being sent to knock on the door of his smoke room. When we came in, he greeted us warmly and asked who we were. I said, "I am Nancy, this is my sister Peggy. We're Nellie's girls." He most carefully arranged the chairs for us where we would have a gentle and not scorching warmth from the fire, and light from the windows would not be in our eyes, and then offered us each a glass of port. Despite nudges from Peggy, I accepted, and there we sat, aged about 9 and 13, sipping port and eating biscuits from his china barrel with the silver lid and handle, while he told us what a mistake it had been to put the railway where it was, and that people had been singing carols most beautifully outside his window. As we left, he thanked us and said, "I have enjoyed your visit very much. Come again, my dears." But Mother, that's his daughter, my granny, said the railway line was the extension from Camberwell to Box Hill and been put in ages before. There had been no carolers recently. It wasn't Christmas. But their grandfather was, without a clue about the present, but practising all his graceful manners towards ladies, as he apparently thought we were, with the same care as ever. If Mother had known he had given us port, she would have had a pink fit. He died, he was Charlie Mailing, remembered him with his snow white hair, with abundant, wavy and silky, with sideboards, beard and moustache. Charlie Mailing said his tenor voice never left him, and he would sing snatches of hymns and songs. So that would be the hymns sung in this church as he sat in his old chair. He was a great reader and quoter Shakespeare, and had some well-used Scott, Dickens and comparable authors. He died on the 10th of March 1931, aged 90, and was buried with Jane Emma and their 2 children who died in infancy in Burundara Cemetery. Now, after he died, regrettably in his will, I'm now going to come to his family, some of them anyway, and I'm not going to go that much longer, but he did something very unwise in his will, because he included a provision in his will that his chattels, or at least many of them, were to be auctioned between his children. And in any event, my granny, this is not recorded by my mother, but my mother told me, well, granny turned up at the auction with her eye on a number of items, but one of her brothers mischievously outbid her systematically on these items, and she was very angry, apparently. About the only thing she may have come away with was his deed box, and there is his deed box, and in fact, it's got JB mailing on it. The interesting thing to me is it's also got stickers on it, number 51, so this was one of the lots in the auction. All I can say to all of us is don't put a provision like that in your will if you want to have good relations between your children after you die. I'm now going to talk a bit about his family, some of them. The first one I'm going to talk about is William Saunders Mailing. William Saunders Mailing was born in 1865. His house was 17 Balwyn Road, still there, on the corner of Erica Street. Yeah, okay. It's just down the road. That's his house, built in the 1880s. He married his wife Hannah then. I've got a couple of pictures of them in the backyard carousing with a brother. I think it's Charles, actually. He features again, so maybe he had not learnt from his earlier experience. In any event, they're real lovely Victorian pictures. So William and Hannah had no children. He was a builder. Hannah died in the 1920s, and he was then cared for by a lady who I knew as Auntie Annie, who was a relative, Annie Bailey, and she was about 17 years younger. She was his housekeeper, and he said to her, my mother told me, he said to her, Annie, if you and I are living together, people will talk. We should get married. And so I have a lovely photo, which regrettably I've not been able to unearth for today, of this couple on their wedding day. It would have been at this church, and in the early 1930s. And it's rather lovely, you know, there's this man, they're no longer in the prime of life, so to speak. There's this man in his mid-60s and this lady aged about 50 on their wedding day. A lovely picture. He died in 1939, William Saunders Mailing. When I first came to live in Balwyn Road, there was a lady called Miss Poxon, who was elderly then. She lived at 26 Balwyn Road, which is just down the road. And Miss Poxon, as a little girl, had lived there, and she said she used to, mischievously knock on the door and then run away, and this old man would come out, "Who's there? Who's there?" So that was William Saunders Mailing. Of the daughters, Eliza Sis married a Mr. Funkhauser, and there are many Funkhausers in this area. They were orchardists. My mother told me, my mother lived in Moreland in the 1920s, and they used to go for holidays to Box Hill. We went to holidays to Box Hill, and there were orchards there, and that would be with the Funkhausers. Alice married a Mr. Tobias, and the Jack Tobias Oval at Camberwell Grammar, that's their son, Jack, who I met but was tragically killed in the 1960s. But he did a great deal for Camberwell Grammar, and the Oval is named after him. His older sister, Mona, Auntie Mona, was a pioneer in the teaching of, children who were at school having a bit of trouble with their reading. she was a pioneer in that, and I believe there's a Mona Tobias room at an educational establishment in the city. The other child I know about is the youngest daughter, Nellie, who was my granny. Nellie married, as I said, she trained as a nurse, and she married William Hayward in 1909. He was a school teacher. He later became the vice principal of Box Hill High. They had 2 children. They had 3. One was John Hayward, my uncle, who was the first man to practice as a thoracic surgeon in Australia, and my mother, who was a microbiologist. So that is my talk. I regret to say I know bits and pieces about other mailings, but that's basically it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Some people are very lucky to have such knowledge of their family and the history, and I guess we're very fortunate that there are those people that have it, so that apart from the real history, there's the amusing anecdotes, which sort of puts everything into this perspective for it. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
A most enjoyable
Thank
talk.
you. It was my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks very much. Very briefly, Funkhausers were orchardists. John Barnett, would you stand up, please? If you want a good speaker about the orchardists and fruit and vegetable sellers in Box Hill, have a chat to John, because his father was one of the many in the Box Hill region, and he tells us about the tram and Tram Road and the little battles which went between the 2 sides. Quick little comment, toilets first left. Supper, afternoon tea, it's not that late. A thank you especially to the parishioners of St Barnabas who provided afternoon tea, to Barbara and Elizabeth, my wife. You'll enjoy yourself. So please have a chat and tea or a coffee. Thanks very much.